Thank you for the letter and from Mr Mills.
You've got both parts, sorry.
I do, thank you, yes. Thank you very much. Essentially what this letter does is confirm the information that I had received from some taxpayers that recovery action is undertaken by the ATO even when the amount is disputed. The information I have also is that there are instances, and I certainly know of some, where it turns out that the debt claimed by the ATO is not upheld. On appeal, one way or another, it turns out that the taxpayer does not owe the ATO money. Can I ask you, and I'm not sure whether it's Mr Jordan or somebody else there, what's your policy in those situations where it turns out the ATO pursued the debt and was wrong, turned out to be incorrect?
We can try and answer part of the question, Senator.
Robert Rabbit, he's in charge, Deputy Commissioner in charge of debt.
Robert Ravanella, Deputy Commissioner for Debt. It is true that in some circumstances we do take recovery action when debts are underway. The numbers are very small, and it's in circumstances where we believe there is risk of criminal activity, Phoenix activity, or things like dissipation of assets, so it puts at risk the collection of revenue. It would be our preference to work with stakeholders where there is a dispute and there are risks to enter a 50-50 arrangement, but if that doesn't happen, yes, in a small number of cases we do recovery activity.
Yeah, that didn't answer my question. I know of cases where it's turned out that the taxpayer has been effectively compelled to pay over a disputed assessment, and that down the track the ATO actually returned that money to the taxpayer on the basis that it wasn't owed. Now, what's the ATO's policy in relation to how it handles that?
Well, I think there are two scenarios that could occur there. So this is a situation where there is a dispute active and the dispute is settled in favour of the taxpayer. If the taxpayer had entered a 50-50 arrangement, which is an arrangement whereby we reach agreement with the taxpayer to pay 50% of the primary liability that's being disputed, and should the taxpayer agree to that and the dispute be settled in the taxpayer's favour, that money is refunded and we pay interest. If there was recovery action and we actually recovered the funds from the taxpayer, I'd have to take on notice what action we would do there. I'm not aware of cases of that nature, so I'd take that on notice.
Well, that's not the scenario I was thinking of either.
Okay.
What would you do in a situation where you didn't reach a 50-50 agreement with the taxpayer because the taxpayer said, I don't owe any of the money that you're claiming?
Well, in the vast majority of cases, we take no action. We wait for the dispute to be heard. And as I mentioned earlier, in a small number of cases where we've got, there is risk of dissipation of assets, criminal activity or Phoenix, we do take recovery action. So in a small number of cases, we take recovery action, and it is possible in those cases where we take recovery action that the dispute could be finalised in the taxpayer's favour. And I'm not aware of cases where that's happened, and I'm happy to take on notice what would happen in such a situation.
But presumably it will be refunded with interest.
Of course. Well, that's my guess.
Whether we do anything extra above that, I think, is maybe where you're going to.
Yes.
What he's saying is, in being in charge of debt, he's not aware of those, so we'd have to have a look to see if what we would have done.
Well, there are cases I'm aware of where the taxpayer has been left, in their view, no choice but to pay an assessed amount. The amount has ultimately been returned to the taxpayer because the taxpayer was, the assessment was incorrect, and that they it had the potential, the obligation to hand over that money had the potential to bring the business down on a cash flow basis. So that's where I'm going with this. I'm interested in knowing the ATO's policy around that, requiring assessments to be paid even if they're disputed, the consequences of that payment, what the consequences of that insisting on that payment might be to that business, and how do you know, what's the basis upon which you make an assessment that the business is a potential phoenix or something, that you don't like?
Well, all of those cases are referred to us from our compliance area, so I assume through the compliance audit and dealings with that taxpayer, there is evidence of criminal phoenix activity. In terms of dissipation of assets, we would know whether that business had interests or ability to shift funds offshore. We have access to funds transfers, so we do see situations where funds are moved offshore, so we're pretty clear on those cases. On the phoenix and criminal activity, again, that would be through evidence gathered in audits.
Do you think you've ever had a situation where you have put at risk the viability of the business because of a wrongful assessment?
That's possible.
What would you do if you were aware of such a case?
Well, if there's an incorrect assessment, obviously the assessment would need to be objected to or disputed.
Mm-hmm.
It would need to be heard through the normal process and resolved through the normal process. If there was monies voluntarily paid, they would be refunded, and there would be interest paid on monies voluntarily paid. If there was monies recovered forcefully through, say, garnishees or other processes that we've got available to us, then, as I said, I'm not aware of those cases having occurred.
And look, I mean, we'd have to be really cautious if we thought that demanding a payment of tax was going to put the viability of the business in jeopardy when it's still disputed. I mean, we would really be all over that. So I think the head of debt is saying he's not aware of them. So this is not a common occurrence, clearly. So in the vast majority of cases, we don't seek to recover. The 50-50, as I understand it, prevents interest being accumulated.
Yes.
Yeah, so why would someone want to do a 50-50? Because what it does is prevent interest being charged. If they lose, they don't get charged interest on that period, is my general understanding.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's the incentive to do a 50-50 arrangement. We get half the money, we're happy for that because it's a bit, they don't get high-ish interest charged to them. Whether we sought to recover, I think that's what Mr Ravanello is saying, is pretty unusual unless there are some factors like risk of flight or dissipation of assets, that sort of thing. You've hit on a very important point there, though, this phoenixing. Why phoenixing still happens in some respects is because it is difficult to understand sometimes when is there a genuine business failure through normal circumstances of just bad trading or whatever versus an intent to avoid obligations in there. Very difficult. And that's where sometimes we err on the side of give you the benefit of the doubt and maybe lose out. But Neil, did you want to say anything from the clients or general counsel?
Well, ultimately, if there was defective administration in that, a compensation claim could be made and dealt with. But that would have to be demonstrated that the assessment process and the debt collection process were amounted to defective administration.
You do pay compensation, do you?
On occasion, I'm not aware of having one over this specific issue, but we administer the Commonwealth CDDA scheme like every other department and pay compensation in the absence of legal liability where it's appropriate to do so under that scheme where taxpayers apply.
And this is a whole of government scheme, I think, administered by the Department of Finance. And
that's right.
And we look to pay compensation if we've made a mistake and it has caused economic loss to the person. So that is there. And
Well,
what's been said is we're not aware of any that have had to do with this debt type recovery problem.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Way over time.
Yeah, I know. Okay, I do have some cases that come pretty close to that, but I don't want to talk about them today, so we might leave it there and may come back to it
look,
another time.
If the people want to or allow you to, we're very open to have that given to us, and we'll deal with you or them and really go through that, because clearly there's an issue, right? And would like to understand it. If we have done the wrong thing, why? Or is it just a misunderstanding somewhere here? So we'd be really happy to look at them. In a people say, oh, why would we disclose things that... Like, we're not going to do anything. We genuinely want to understand if there's a problem on our side.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you, Chair.